Baller Hamilton, bad luck Hulkenberg, and better luck next time for Charles Leclerc. I'm Josh, and you're in the second seat. Well, welcome back, everyone, and what a fantastic Barcelona Grand Prix we had. Isn't it fantastic to see Lewis Hamilton back on the top step of the podium, finally achieving his first win for Ferrari, and Ferrari achieving their first win since Mexico 2024, which was, funnily enough, not Charles Leclerc either. It was Carlos Sainz. So fantastic outcome for them this weekend, particularly because Lewis didn't seem to have the pace throughout any of the practice sessions. He sort of struggled. Charles definitely had improved, particularly after changing the brakes from Brembo, and that is a completely different matter altogether, but seems to be justified in the complaint and thus the switch. But coming back to Lewis, showed incredible pace during qualifying to put it on this first row. And then, funnily enough, Forza Ferrari from a strategy perspective, because they blew it out of the water with a 3-stop. Most teams thought that a 2-stop was going to be the way to go, and I can understand that, particularly running 2 sets of mediums and then a hard. That was what was in my head as well. If you had that, or most teams probably had the 1 set of medium and 2 sets of hards, so figured that would be the main strategy, and they were looking at that from the get-go. I think most of the teams saw that. Some started with some older softs, or the midfield and lower bottom teams used new softs because they didn't make it into Q2. But high risk, high reward. Unfortunately, for most of them, it didn't pay off. So, but in Ferrari's way, they drove and planned and drove a 3-stop from the get-go, pitting on lap 11 and just running, effectively running away with it from there, despite not really getting the lead until just before the safety car with Alonso crashing. So you could argue there was a little bit of luck there. I think the safety car was probably good timing, and I will definitely highlight that. But the fact of the matter is that Lewis still won by the length of a pit stop. He still won by 20 odd seconds, if not a little bit more. So, for me, that discounts the safety car side in terms of the pit stop that he gained. It negates a full pit stop as well. So, props to Lewis. Well done to him. He has been driving absolutely fantastic the last 3 weeks, or the last month, really, noting that there was a week break between Montreal and Monaco. So could we see this as the start of his run for a record 8th title? I mentioned something similar in my Bahrain testing recaps back at the start of the year, highlighting that Ferrari was my prancing dark horse. So this could be the start of their comeback. And with the results of the Duo, the additional development and upgrade opportunities coming to fruition, Ferrari now have 2 upgrades up their sleeves for their internal combustion engine, and top speed has been a bit of an issue with them. Their downforce, or their aerodynamics rather, have been on point, and they've been able to do things through particularly the lower speed turns that no other teams have. So it'll be interesting to see how that manifests. There are rumours that they're bringing an upgrade based on them expecting to fall at least 2% below the top engine from an Duo perspective to Austria. We'll see if that eventuates. Really keen to see what they come back with. And there's a lot of parallels starting to be drawn between Lewis coming across to Ferrari and start of a new reign or regime or culture, however you want to look at it, and very much aligning it with the likes of when Michael Schumacher left Benetton and came across to Ferrari and brought not just his skill, but his understanding of car design, vehicle engineering, and the culture that he brought with him as well. So I'm really intrigued to see how this pans out over the rest of the year. And in particular, I'm really keen to see how the other teams react. Mercedes now has, in my mind, a fight on their hands, and not just internally. And I'll come to that a bit later on, because before I move into the Mercedes side, I really want to talk about our two Oceania lads up front, Oscar Piastri and Liam Lawson. Both had, I'll start with Oscar first. Oscar had a really intriguing weekend. He showed an extreme amount of promise in the practice sessions, either at the top or, in the top three, and only, less than a tenth off the pace largely throughout the entire weekend. And then, unfortunately, that early potential didn't translate into qualifying. Really not sure what happened with him there. Just couldn't seem to put it all together. His teammate Lando Norris managed to get into the second row for qualifying, which was fantastic for him, and McLaren more broadly. But Oscar qualifying P7, as opposed to, I think an expectation that he was going to be certainly the top three from a qualifying perspective. So, and at one point before the red flag in Q3, he was on provisional pole ahead of Max Verstappen. So no idea. I'm a bit lost for words with Oscar for this weekend. Still managed a P5, which is a pretty good result from a team perspective. Obviously, Lando out qualifying and then out racing Oscar, finishing P3, so getting that final podium place, which was fantastic for the team more broadly. But yeah, so I think the thing that's sort of frustrating from a fan perspective is that the team don't expect themselves to be performing, and that's okay. There's hints of promise and potential there, and I think a lot of us, certainly myself from an Oscar fan perspective, are probably too early hanging our hats on that practice session performance. You would think, though, for FP3, which is normally pretty indicative of how things are going to go, that leading into qualifying, that's what would eventuate. So for him, there's plenty of development to come. Frustrating to hear the likes of Jacques Villeneuve criticising Oscar, particularly after 2025 and the season that he had. We forget that this young man rather, is only in his fourth year and still has a lot of development to go. His growth potential is still quite large, but Jacques Villeneuve saying what he's saying, that he's lost market value and all the rest of it, you've got to put it into context, right? Like, Oscar is still performing. He is either at or above his reigning world champion teammate in terms of qualifying. He's out-qualified Lando so far this year. He's largely out-raced Lando this year, and is still only within a few points, in P5, P6 respectively for the two of them. So, given the performance of the team this year, you can't compare apples and oranges in this instance. I think it's an ignorant point of view from Jacques. And, he probably needs to contextualize his own thoughts a bit more before he starts throwing shade at other drivers. If anyone deserves criticism this year from a driver perspective, it's someone like George Russell. And like I said earlier, I'll touch on George a little bit later. But to lambast Piastri for the way he's going so far this year, yes, he's not performing to the same level, but he also doesn't have the same car. And there's probably a lack of confidence there in the car rather than his own skill. He's shown that he's still got the ability to fight with the best. He's not lost that skill overnight. Oscar's drive in Japan was impeccable. Like, probably for mine, one of his best drives ever, and still one of the best drives this year. So, he should have won that race if it wasn't for a safety car getting Kimi Antonelli into the lead and the rocket ship that is the Mercedes this year. So, and Oscar showed that he had the defensive ability to hold off George Russell in that instance. So, really frustrating to hear those sorts of comments. I think short-sighted and lacking context. So, but in terms of our other Oceania lad, our brother from across the ditch, Liam Lawson, consecutive points in multiple races now. He is driving incredibly. Racing Bulls have done really well for themselves over the past few weeks. And it wasn't long ago that I was sitting on my couch with Glenn from Aussie Motorsport Fan talking about Liam and his performances so far over the last 12 to now 18 months, and that he really needed to sort himself out, pick himself up, and start leading that Racing Bulls team. And he's definitely done that. The last 3 weeks, he's out-qualified Arvid Lindblad. He's out-raced Arvid Lindblad, outscored him as well, and shows that, he's ready to step forward in leading that team into the rest of the season. So it's really positive outcome for Liam, and we'll see how things go from there. Funny thing with Liam, though, was that situation with Hulkenberg. Huge amount of bad luck. Really, really unfortunate that Liam's hit the gravel and it's flicked gravel up into the emergency extinguisher lever on the side of Hulkenberg's Audi, triggering the internal fire extinguisher that just shuts down the electronics for the car, and that just ruined Hulkenberg's race. And he ended up being one of 8 DNFs in Barcelona, which was huge, largely for reliability issues. So really unfortunate for Nico, especially because Audi looked like they were going to score points, and Nico was going to score his first set of points. I think he was on track for P9 in that race, which, fantastic for him, and it shows Audi on the right track. They're going to get a couple of upgrades under the Duo regulation piece as well. So for them, it'll be intriguing to see what they bring later in the year. They have had the best top speed of any of the teams so far this year. Gabby Bortoletto setting a new record for the season at 360 kilometers an hour in Barcelona. So speed isn't an issue for them. The chassis side and some reliability pieces seems to be the problem for Audi. So hopefully they can get that under wraps and bring something better for their package later in the year. Now, speaking of packages and reliability, we saw a second technical DNF for Mercedes this week. This time, though, Kimi Antonelli. He had that battle with George Russell towards the latter stages of the race and managed to ping him in what was a really nice overtake, but shortly after, despite starting to pull away, ended up having PU problems and had to pull off, and the car basically died on them. So, as much as I don't wish negativity on any of the drivers, I think for me, it was good to see a little bit of bad luck go Kimi's way, because as I said last week, my view is that pretty much every race so far, bar Monaco, Kimi has been the beneficiary of a number of bad luck scenarios towards other people, including his own teammate. In terms of strategy in Japan, that ended up allowing him to take advantage of the safety car rather than George, because Mercedes reacted in the wrong way, versus George's technical DNF in Montreal, where he was definitely in charge of that race. He'd won the sprint race, etc. So, unfortunate for Kimi, and I do feel a little bit bad. But on the other hand, I think it swings and roundabouts, and he was due something like that to happen. The other side of the coin is that Mercedes also screwed the pooch with George and his strategy during the race as well. Mercedes reacted, I think, incorrectly, 2020 hindsight, to Lewis pitting early. They pitted George early. He asked the question, does this mean we are going to a 3-stop strategy? And the team said, no, we're still sticking with a 2-stop. And I think that's largely what's contributed to Kimi catching George was that tyre difference, the tyre delta, to use that terminology, delta meaning difference. And if it wasn't for that, I think George still would have had Kimi's measure. That tyre difference made a huge impact on George's ability to maintain pace and move forward and catch Lewis, and Kimi wasn't going to catch him anyway. So I think McLaren, unfortunate but very apt faux pas there. I think Mercedes are very much falling into a Silver Arrows rules without it actually being Silver Arrows rules. For mine, and I mentioned this with a colleague the other day, Kimi to Toto is very much Lando to Zach Brown. Unfortunately for George, he is, he may as well be the unwanted stepchild of that relationship. And I could be wrong, but certainly that's the way it looks on the surface. I haven't seen Toto be animated as much as he was about Kimi's DNF in relation to George's one in, say, Montreal. So, I think Mercedes need to be really careful about how they manage this and the build-up of public perception, because McLaren copped it in the media last year for their papaya rules, and there was significant work that needed to be done from a media management perspective in that space. So if I'm Mercedes, I'm looking at what happened with Hamilton and Rosberg back in 2016 and trying to make sure that doesn't repeat itself. Yes, the drivers might understand that they are part of the team and that the team comes first, but if there is a perception of favoritism, certainly if I'm George Russell, I'm not putting the team first. I'm going to put myself first, and I'm going to try and win that drivers' championship, regardless of the way it gets handled. So, definitely something for Mercedes to look at, and I think they need to start looking at the way they manage their strategy as well. Largely, they've been pretty good this year, but there's been a couple of times, most notably when George has been leading the race, it couldn't look more as if they're favouring Kimi. And I get it. Toto's protege, he brought him up. He's playing a father figure type role and things like that too. But it's not a good look for the team externally. So where do we go from here? We reset and we get ready for Austria, for Spielberg. So, Red Bull Ring is a track that will play very well into the hands of Mercedes, particularly for this year and the way their car's set up. And I think they'll do incredibly well next week, noting that there's no race this coming weekend. So, and then, it'll be interesting to see if Ferrari's rumoured packages come to fruition and turn up there. So, I look at Red Bull Ring and think it's going to be a fantastic race. I think McLaren probably won't be up there. Maybe Lando. I'm not really sure. He obviously did really well there last year. P1 and then P2 for Oscar. It's another Uber home race for Max. And I expect that the way he performed last weekend in Barcelona, that he'll be up there as well. The Red Bull RB22 is starting to look really good. The packages just need to continue to focus on the chassis side. they've had some troubles with the reliability in the engine piece, which is why I think they're challenging the Aduo results, which is understandable, and going from there. So, but finally, speaking of challenges, this mess with Pierre Gasly, I think the FIA and F1 management really need to sort it out, and they need to sort it out sooner rather than later. We are almost 2 weeks down the track from completion of Monaco. The result's been overturned in terms of pushing Gasly back to P3 and having his penalties squashed. And I think rightly so in that manner. Where it gets tricky and messy is that there is reports that the FIA knew that pit lane was measured incorrectly. The timing loops had been measured incorrectly. That's a concern in and of itself. We can't operate on speculation. So let's assume that they didn't know or, hadn't operated effectively in that space. They've done the right thing, I think, by reinstating Pierre, and squashing those penalties and reinstating him to P3. Means it's disappointing for Pierre missing out on the podium aspect, but he still achieved that. The question for me is not so much how do you apply it to all the other teams that serve their penalties, because they have, done the right thing in my mind in the race. You've been given a penalty, you serve the penalty in the race. Carry on. If it's not readily apparent at the pit wall at the time that the penalty is given that there are issues, and you choose to serve the penalty and then stuff comes to light afterwards, too bad. The analogy I would use for those of us in Australia and New Zealand is a rugby league match or any other football style code where the official makes a decision and then the benefit of hindsight and multiple video angles and things like that shows that the decision was wrong. You just got to live with it. They're human. It is what it is. In this instance, we are now, as I said before, nearly 2 weeks down the track, and we've got confirmation that Mercedes is looking into it from a lawyer perspective and what they can do to support George Russell because of the issues that happened with his 5-second penalty and then the drive-through, etc. We now have confirmation that McLaren and Red Bull are also participating in it. And it's not about the points, as I've said previously in some stories on Instagram. It's about the processes. And the cans of worm that get opened up by enabling this to occur. And part of my issue with it all is that you've got 96 hours to respond. That, in my mind, is a huge amount of time to actually review and put something forward. That needs to be reduced. I think 48 hours is plenty of time to review data after a decision is made, and then lodging an appeal. But I think it needs to be action, reaction, counteraction, and that's it. 3 steps, no more. You've had the action, which was Gasly's penalties. You've had the reaction, which was the appeal, and then you've had the counteraction, which was the appeal getting through and Gasly being reinstated. As far as I'm concerned, anything from the teams now needs to be about adjusting processes so that, we don't have this precedence down the track rather than trying to re-overturn Gasly's P3 and turn it into this, part of my French, shit show that it is now. So, unfortunate look for the sport. It's an unfortunate look for the teams because it's starting to look petty on multiple different sides, and it's really bad look in terms of the overall management of the sport. So it just needs to get fixed and fixed quickly, and a decision made, and then that's it. From a leadership perspective, decision made. Here's my justification. You get on board or you don't. I don't care either way, but it's staying, and we go forward from there. So, yeah. But as I mentioned before, we're looking forward to Red Bull Ring in a little over a week's time. really looking forward to seeing the upgrade packages that the teams bring to that space, particularly Ferrari. I think, Charles Leclerc was unlucky in Monaco, unlucky again in Barcelona this week. Just a couple of minor errors on his side, and if they can improve that overall top speed and continue to show that development that they have over the last couple of weeks with Lewis Hamilton leading the charge, then I think there is definitely going to be some challenges for the constructors and potentially drivers' championship down the track. So, yeah, as we wrap up, I would love to hear your thoughts. Feel free to send in an email, leave a comment in the comment section here on Spotify, or shoot me a DM via Instagram to let us know your thoughts. Make sure you're following both Spotify, Instagram, and hit subscribe for those of you that follow along on YouTube. Enjoy the rest of the week. Cheers.